All right, good evening, everyone. This webinar is being brought to you by the American College of Radiology and the ACR Commission on Radiation Oncology Education Committee. I will be serving as tonight's moderator. My name is Aaron Bush. I'm a PGY3 radiation oncology resident physician at the Mayo Clinic in Florida. Today, we'll be discussing the all-important topic of declining applicant numbers in radiation oncology. Please remember to mute your microphones and use the chat feature to submit questions you have throughout the webinar. We will have time for audience Q&A at the end, and we ask you fill out our very brief survey once this event has concluded. Before we begin the session, please join us in a moment of silence to acknowledge the difficult times that everyone continues to face with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you. For those who are unaware, this webinar is part of an ongoing series where we tackle the most pressing issues in radiation oncology today. Be sure to check out our previous RO-APM debate if you missed it. Next slide, please. Objectives for this webinar are listed here. Our ultimate goal is to raise awareness on the current state of the radiation oncology match and have an open discussion on how to appropriately respond. Next slide. Prior to our discussion, I would like to very briefly review trends in the radiation oncology match over the past several years. From 2018 to 2021, applicant numbers significantly declined from 222 to 175 total. Correlated with this was a decrease in US allopathic seniors from 194 to only 104. This represents the greatest percent decline in applicants of any medical specialty. Next slide. In response, programs filling through the Supplemental Offer and Acceptance Program, or SOAP, have dramatically risen over the same time frame, from 2.6% utilization in 2018 to over 10% use in both 2020 and 2021. This makes radiation oncology the specialty with the greatest proportion of positions filled among all fields of medicine. Due to increased SOAP use, total positions filled have remained relatively stable, with over 90% of positions filled each year from 2018 to 2021. Next slide. With that in mind, let's move on. Again, I will be moderating tonight's discussion. Thank you to everyone so far that has joined us. Next slide. I would like to introduce our panelists for this webinar. First, we have Dr. Brian Cavanaugh, who is currently professor and chair of radiation oncology at the University of Colorado. He's a past president of the American Society for Radiation Oncology and remains active in that organization. Among his current roles in that regard is ongoing service as a faculty liaison to the Association of Residents in Radiation Oncology. Our second panelist is Dr. Alan Hartford, graduated from Harvard Medical School in '92 and subsequently received his PhD in political economy and government from Harvard in '97, while completing his residency in radiation oncology at Mass General. Dr. Hartford now is professor of medicine at Dartmouth Skeisel School of Medicine and program director of Dartmouth Hitchcock's Radiation Oncology Residency, which he helped found in 2016. His career spans over 2 decades, where he has been dedicated to patient care, clinical research, leadership, and medical education. Next, we have Dr. Neha Babawala, currently an associate professor and the vice chair for education in the Department of Radiation Oncology at the University of Pennsylvania and dean of admissions at Perelman School of Medicine at Penn. Dr. Babawala's clinical specialty is GU cancers, and her research has focused on numerous improvements in delivery of photon and proton-based radiation. Dr. Babawala serves on the board of directors for ASTRO and is a member on committees within ASCO, the ACR, NCI, and more. Dr. Babawala is also the chair of the ACGME Residency Review Committee and recently completed a 6-year term on the executive committee of the Association of Directors of Radiation Oncology Programs. Finally, we would like to welcome arguably our most important panelist, Erica Bracci, who is a 4th-year medical student at the University of Florida College of Medicine and currently an applicant for the 2022 Radiation Oncology Match. She completed her undergraduate degree at Elon University and is a new member of the American College of Radiology. Thanks again to all of our panelists for participating in this webinar. Let's now move on to our question-centered discussion. The first question will be for Alan, Brian, and Neha. Radiation oncology applicants have objectively decreased over the past several match cycles. Why do you believe this is occurring? Let's start with Alan.
Thanks so much, Aaron. I think primarily this is a perception problem. It's possible that there are underlying realities behind any kind of a perception, but I'm not sure that the realities here really measure up to what seems to be driving the community. It's a little bit difficult to understand. Underlying possibilities would be the perception of a worsening job market or a fear of declining reimbursement, maybe souring of the practice environment, maybe other specialties offer better alternatives. At first blush, I don't think these actually meet reality. Astro recently had a poll of the SCARAP membership. This SCARAP is the Society for Chairs of Academic Radiation Oncology Programs. About half of them responded, meaning about 50 or so. And of those, they have for 2022, 98 job openings, of which 2 out of 3 are still open. And they anticipate 86% anticipate offering additional jobs in the next 2 to 3 years. So this is just a sampling of half of academic radiation oncology programs, and they are in actuality even in that subgroup offering a very substantial number of jobs, and it doesn't include looking at private practice at all. That survey, in terms of looking at the residents who are coming out of those programs, 44 out of the 102 graduates already had jobs in hand. So, and this is now still the fall. We're talking about next spring or next summer. And a very large percentage of the job openings are still open. At present, 62 out of 98 are still open. So numbers like these don't make it sound as though there are no jobs available. It may not be always an ideal job, but I'm not sure that any of us during our residencies, when we finished, immediately got the ideal job. You know, the general teaching is there are 3 major factors you look at for a job, which would be the actual location, the salary, and the perks. And lastly, you're going to be practicing in the particular specialty of radiation oncology that you want. And the general rule is you'll never get all 3, but maybe about 2 out of 3. And I'm not sure that's any different now than it was, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Reimbursement is declining, that's true, but it's certainly healthier than many specialties. Our practice environment is becoming richer, better radiation technologies, more sophisticated treatments vis-a-vis other modalities. Cancer biology is expanding by leaps and bounds. And I don't think many other specialties are actually able to keep pace in quite the same way. So, of course, we all speak from our own perspectives, but my own perspective about the job market and about kind of the larger world of radiation oncology looking into the future is actually very, very bright. So I come back to the answer, which is I think this is a perception problem.
Aaron, I think you're muted.
Appreciate that. I was just saying, thanks so much for all that information. It's definitely a very common perspective, and I'm interested to hear everyone else's opinions as well. And so we'll move on next to Brian.
Well, I also echo Alan's thanks for the chance to participate. It's an important topic, and we'll probably go all over the place as we go through this discussion. And I'm probably going to go suddenly in a different direction, and I'll talk about a few other things. For additional historical context, I actually entered the field at a time when there was an emerging excess or perceived excess of radiation oncology residents. When I started was the year that there was a decision to expand or lengthen the residency training program. Now, I must say, it is entirely possible that my chair at the time, Dr. Prosnitz, just took one look at me and said, this guy's going to need a remedial year. I know we got to have him around here for 4 years. And he probably just called up a few other chairs and says, I don't know what's going on. These people, they need more time. And then it probably caught on that said, oh, if we expand it, that might be a way to slow down the rate of people going through this. So I think I was probably the seminal event based on my need for a remedial year that caused the expansion from 3 to 4 years. Be that as it may, I do recall coming out and having a number of offers, not a huge chunk of offers. And I took one and it was okay. It was something I worked with for a few years, and 8 years actually, and moved on. And, we always tell our own graduates, your first job's not going to be your final job. And so that's a truth that I think has played out in a lot of situations. In terms of just random fluctuations or seasonal fluctuations, or I should say periodic fluctuations in the cycles, I think things do just tend to ebb and flow. It's possible that there isn't the same level of high intrinsic interest in the field among the recent graduates of med school, in addition to other factors that could be coming to play. I mean, we have a job that involves learning a certain set of skills. It is appealing to some people. It doesn't appeal to everybody. Some people would much rather be in a surgery training program. I mean, my dad was a surgeon. He was a role model for me. I chose not to go into that field because for me, it didn't appeal to me. I didn't feel like learning that skill set, but I'm sure glad some people do know it, okay? Because if I ever need my gallbladder taken out, I sure as heck want somebody knows what they're doing. I had shoulder surgery a few months ago. I wasn't interested in ortho. I'm sure glad my orthopedic surgeon was interested in ortho and studied hard and learned how to do shoulder surgeries. So on one level, it's just, I think there is just going to be some variation in whether or not things are appealing for a certain generation or a certain time. So for example, when I entered the field, just to continue to date myself and to make myself more and more of a dinosaur, okay, we're just going to establish that beyond a doubt, right? So when I entered the field, the thing that was new and different in coming on board was actually 3D treatment planning. And what was interesting about that is that I saw the software that was then being used. It was, game-changing software in a sense to a lot of people. And the funny thing was that in my late 20s, I was thinking, okay, well, that's nice. That's good software. Do they know that there's a pub down the street that has a video game that has much better graphics than this treatment planning software? So it's a funny kind of thing. So these odd generational disconnects that might even have people think differently about it. So we have a generation of folks who are pretty tech savvy, and who's to say that the idea of doing radiation oncology as a thing you're going to do for 35 years of your life, okay, I mean, it's cool. I think it's cool, but maybe it's not as cool to everybody. And I accept that because we still do need people who learn how to do GI and learn how to do ophthalmology and learn how to do all the other important things in medicine. So I think there's been this fear or paranoia that fluctuations in the amount of people who might be interested is automatically a reason for us to feel, I don't know, somehow diminished. But I want to just get it out there that I don't think there's any reason to feel it for that reason. I think some of Alan's points about the perception of concerns about the job market are variable, and I think there's still some difficulty in understanding. I think we're going to touch on this later about whether or not we could get to a solid understanding of that, but I'll leave that for a little bit later in the discussion, and I'll maybe give Neha a chance to chime in to give some of her first thoughts.
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, it's good to know why our residencies are a year longer. So thank you.
Exactly. I'm sorry about that. I apologize. It was
but
me.
we'll move on to Neha.
Yes, thank you to the ACR and to all of you for having me on this panel with these wonderful colleagues. And I think, what I'll start by saying is anything that we talk about here ultimately is hypothesis on our part. I'd like to think educated hypotheses, but in the end, I commend you for having Erica on here because ultimately it's the students who are voting with their feet, and they are the ones who truly know their reasons and their rationale for the specialty that they choose. I think I'd start by saying that decrease, yes, they have objectively decreased. The question is, were the numbers that we had before right? Were they necessary? Were they appropriate? So, this idea of the decline, there's a tone that's placed on that's a negative thing. And I think one thing we have to consider is, was it increased and was it too high to begin with? So that is something to put out there because the truth is, and we will talk more about, obviously, workforce needs and projections and all of the trials and tribulations of even pretending to know what the future holds. I think we've learned that in the past year and a half that we're very poor at judging that, even if we think we know what we're doing. So, let's first focus on the fact that, yes, the numbers are lower. Whether that's a good or bad thing, depends on which perspective you're coming from. The truth is, when you look at the AAMC, so it's American Association of Medical Colleges, conducts a graduation questionnaire for all graduating seniors from US medical schools. And if you look at some of their most recent data, so this is sort of 2019 pre-pandemic, and I think that's important because that sort of gives you in a way, the best case scenario of how things used to look. 99% of those graduating medical student seniors said that they chose their specialty selection based on what they call personality fit. Okay, so this idea that, you know, I belong in this specialty, it fits who I am and what I am, and then specialty content is right up there, 98%. And then close third is role model influence. And then you get into the middle, and you could argue if people are being truthful or not. Then in the sort of 60 to 70% of students, graduating students, you know, espouse things such as work-life balance, future family plans, income expectations. You know, maybe it's higher than that, but the truth is, you know, to the extent that there are potential issues about exactly how many radiation oncologists we need to be training, what is their prospect in terms of their future careers, where will they get jobs, will they be happy in those jobs? If you put that aside for a second, there is still that factor that we are a very small specialty. We don't typically get easy exposure, let's just say, to medical students. You do have to go out of your way or have a medical school that is committed to reaching out to first and second year medical students, providing them opportunities to come shadow. Obviously, the pandemic really put a halt on so much of that. We have a lot of medical schools that don't have a radiation oncology presence, or if they do, the radiation oncologists are not necessarily involved in the medical school in any you know, sort of more transparent way. And so it can be very difficult to have a role model influence, convey our specialty content, convey that, oh, this would be a great fit for your personality. So, you know, I think that is something to consider, as long as we do it in a way that is not recruiting for the sake of recruiting, but doing so thoughtfully, making sure that students have a very clear view, to the extent that we can provide a clear view, of what life as a radiation oncologist is like, so that they can make that decision, but at least have it on their radar. And then I guess the other part I would say is that, you know, the other reason it's decreasing at the end of the day is that there has been some, you know, fluctuation in international medical graduate applications. This year, for example, it's lower than it was last year. So even though the total number appears to be in something of a steady decline, one might look at the composition of who's applying and how that does and does not impact the numbers. And ultimately, you know, try to figure out, to the extent that, as Alan said, you know, it is about perception. And then where does the perception deviate from actual facts? Well, that's where I think we can focus, hopefully, more of our conversation today. But I do think it's important to remember that most students are looking for something that gives them maximum opportunities in their career and fits their personalities and is intellectually stimulating, but also is going to give them, you know, sort of a solid base for their financial and personal security. And I think because radiation oncology by its nature is a relatively narrow and small specialty, we do lose a lot of those students who are looking to have sort of more options rather than fewer narrow options. And to the extent that that perception is real, I think that also influences some of the choices.
All right, thank you so much. So many excellent points there that hopefully we'll get a chance to dive a little deeper in over the next hour. At this point, we do have a audience poll question and that we'll just kind of test to make sure that that's working. The question is, are you concerned with the recent decrease in radiation oncology applicants?
Aaron, if I might ask, while we're getting this information in there, there are a couple of Q&A questions coming in. Do you want to try to tackle those in real time or save them for a little bit later?
It's a good question. And I think it would be nice if we could do them in real time since they're related to questions. But I do want to try and get through the base questions we have here first, and then we'll answer them at the end, or else I think we're going to run out of time. We can also answer them offline if we need to.
One of them is a particularly good one. I'm going to give you like a 5-second answer if I can. That's okay.
Go
So
for
someone
it.
asked, could the trend have something to do with the physics exam results? And I'm going to say, I don't think it has a huge effect. I think that the ABR testing results were a wake-up call to refine the system. And there's a lot of effort that's been triggered as a result to improve the curriculum definition and improve the testing process. So I don't think as an isolated event, that is one thing, because other specialties have had that occur. So I'm going to say, I don't think so, to that question from Byron May. That's a good question. Just my opinion. NEHA is, of course, very involved in curriculum definition and reform efforts of the GME, and I don't know if you have a different take on that.
No, I agree, Brian. I mean, I do think, you know, a lot of what we are teaching and emphasizing both, you know, during residency as well as for the board credentialing process, there's a really some strong efforts to try and align those two and really make sure that the burden does not fall solely on the trainees to figure out what it is that is important to know for clinical practice, for safe clinical practice. So I think we are making improvements after some difficult lessons.
Yeah, I appreciate for sneaking that question in there, and thanks, Dr. May, for asking. Just from the poll, looks like about 75% of people are either somewhat or yes concerned. About a quarter of people not too much concern at all. This next question is going to be directly for Erica. And so, were you or any of your co-applicants hesitant to apply to radiation oncology? If so, please explain. And in other words, what is the general perception of radiation oncology among medical students you know? And then, as a sub question, where does this information come from?
Yeah, so thank you, Aaron, for the introduction, and I'm happy to be here with you guys tonight. Yes, I personally know of several classmates and co-applicants who were hesitant about applying to radiation oncology, even some peers that ultimately decided not to apply or, you know, to pursue a different field. I think in general, the perception is that it's a great specialty. It is rewarding and fulfilling to work with cancer patients. It's intellectually stimulating and ever evolving with new technology. And compared to a lot of other specialties, got a good work life, good compensation. But unfortunately, I think that some of the major concerns that I've heard from peers that hesitated with this were coming from the so-called job market issues and the oversupply of practicing physicians and maybe not getting a job where ultimately we're in the location that you'd want to work. In some cases, I think in some medical schools, and I know this was mentioned earlier, it could be related to a lack of exposure. I know some programs don't have a radiation oncology department and you don't really rotate through radiation oncology as a core rotation. But when they surveyed the class last year in the 2021 match, they said that it was the most popular concern seemed to be the oversupply of practicing physicians and not so much the lack of exposure. I think that the information is coming from multiple sources, one of those being the online forums like Student Doctor Network, Reddit, and the spreadsheet that's online about radiation oncology. Some of the information is definitely coming from there, and I know those sources are used a lot. Interestingly, in that same survey from last year, students seem to know that those are not the most reliable sources of information and they're low quality. You get a lot of anonymous commentators, and more reliable sources for us are really just real practicing physicians, attendings, residents that we can talk to about these issues, as well as peer-reviewed articles, astro panels just like this, where we can have discussions with a more positive culture. And so I think we need to maybe draw more attention over here so that we can not necessarily conceal these concerns, but maybe look at more real and reliable data and foster mentorship relationships between students and residents and attendings.
Yeah, I appreciate that response so much. And I think there's so much to talk about in everything you said. And again, thank you so much for joining this panel, because the perception that you all are having is really, it doesn't matter what everybody else says. Those are the things that we need to discuss and end up doing more objective research on. So thank you again so much. We are going to move on to the next question. And I think it's very related to the answer that you just gave, in that we'll start with Neha as well. So for this one, the perception of a restricted job market, so secondary to residency expansion, oversupply, et cetera, has been previously cited as having a significant role in declining applicant numbers. Do you agree with this? And additionally, we have been informed that recent ASTRO discussions have included a formalized job market evaluation. Can you please update us on the status of this?
Yeah, sure. So in my role as chair of ACGME, I have to make sure and clarify that the role of ACGME was made abundantly clear to me when I joined the committee and now as chair, is that this for all specialties that are accredited through this body. And so, of course, that goes for pretty much every residency you can think of, as well as many fellowships across the healthcare spectrum. That if a program has all of the resources and meets all of the requirements that are set forth by that specialties review committee as being necessary, then not only do they have the right to apply for a training program, they have the right to have a training program, and then the number of trainees, again, should be commensurate with whatever the qualifications of the case log requirements and other clinical experiences are. So all of that is to say, it's nothing to do with who's funding the house staff, but basically if the specialties requirements are met, the review committee's requirements are met, then that program essentially has a right to exist, and they have a right to have as many training spots as they wish. And any action that's taken to try and actively limit those for a program that is otherwise meeting all of their requirements is essentially, seen as anti-trust and essentially opens up the door to lawsuits. And not only that, it's just absolutely not permitted at the level of the ACGME. So with this idea in mind that we have to be counting on programs and program leadership to do the right thing, to be thoughtful about what their own needs are, to see themselves in the context of the larger specialty, whether you're talking about emergency medicine or general surgery or radiation oncology, it requires a lot of responsibility, and I would say onus on the part of the program to be thoughtful about why they need a training program, why they need a training program of a certain size. And are they meeting the needs of those trainees in every way, not just while they're residents, but beyond their training and how they'll do when they're out in the job market. So with all that being said, there has been in the past, and I don't need to tell anyone on this call probably because they've heard or read about the essentially massive expansion over a period of time that in recent years has actually stopped and also actually decreased. So we went from a high of almost 98 programs. Currently, we are closer to 91. Obviously, there are programs that are in various stages of accreditation or accreditation with warning or probation. So that's why I can't give you an exact number right at this moment. But as of today, there are 91. And that's taken a tremendous amount of effort on our part. As a review committee for radiation oncology, what we've focused on during my time on this committee is trying to anyway, improve what the requirements are for a program, what we consider to be important to quality training, not arbitrary requirements just to set up barriers, but things that hopefully are meaningful to trainees themselves. Tremendous amount of input from ARROW, as an association representing residents in radiation oncology, and also ADROP representing the program directors. And I think that that's continuing to be the biggest, hopefully, legacy that can leave behind once I'm rotating off this committee, is to have what we consider shored up requirements so that we do this the right way. And hopefully those programs that cannot meet those requirements recognize that and focus their efforts elsewhere, because just, every department does not need to be in the business of training residents if they cannot meet what we consider to be necessary for quality training. And so when you put that that portion of the question, now I'll sort of address the fact that, nonetheless, I started by saying with the prior question that I don't think any of us really knows what's the exact right number, is the fact that we have declining medical student numbers getting us to where we should be, or were we where we needed to be years ago, back in the heyday when there were too many people applying and they were not matching in RadOnc? The truth presumably lies somewhere in between, is my guess. But in order to help try and ascertain this, under the leadership of ASTRO past president Thomas Eichler, we did put forth, I currently serve on the ASTRO board in the role of secretary treasurer, and was part of the board's work in putting forward this statement in January that really tried to not only acknowledge that a radiation oncology workforce analysis in the United States is needed. But not only for this issue of residency and medical student match, but just for all of us in the specialty currently. What is the demand for rad onc services, and how might we anticipate the change over the next 5 and 10 years based on supply demand projections? And where things stand right now is under the leadership of Pranshu Mohindra, who is the chair of the ASTRO Workforce Subcommittee, together with a task force comprising a wonderful group of colleagues, and the task force being led by Dr. Chirag Shah and Bruce Hafty, is essentially putting out a request for proposals. That request has already been sent out, soliciting companies that specialize in this kind of workforce projection work to submit a proposal. The deadline is actually December 1, so it's just around the corner. And the board's hope, Astro's board hopes to decide which company and which proposal to essentially award the funds to by January 1st, so that we can ideally have this report hopefully within a year, but obviously that's a moving target, with the idea that this labor workforce modeling report can be a resource for all of us. And there's a lot of key objectives and details of the request for proposals that we don't have time to go through today, but certainly I encourage you to look at some of the materials that have been put out by the ASTRO board, and certainly the resources on our website that sort of detail some of these efforts. But I want to say that even when that report comes out, I don't think it's going to suddenly shed a light on all of our problems and become the only source of information, but I think it will be a critical one. And I'm hopeful that it will fill some of the gaps where we currently have rampant speculation. So I hope I addressed your question. I'm sorry, I think I tried to discuss both parts there.
Oh no, that was an excellent response, and yeah, exactly. For the sake of time, we can't go into all the details, but I really appreciate the updates that you have on that task force, and it's gonna be really interesting to watch how that develops, and if there's ways that we can contribute to that, we definitely would like that information as well, and we can get that out to people listening today and just in general. So thank you so much. We will move on to the next question because it kind of blends into the previous one, and then I'll pick on you now one more time to start this one, and then we'll open it up to the other panelists. So despite significant decreases in applicant numbers, the percentage of filled programs has remained relatively stable, and so over 90%, through 2018 to now, largely secondary to use of the Supplemental Offer and Acceptance Program, or SOAP. Is the increased utilization of SOAP appropriate? If so, why? If not, why? And what intervention should be implemented?
So I want to be very upfront and say that in general, when you're talking about medical students, aspiring physicians, it has to be such an individualized decision. There can be medical students who thought they wanted to be neurosurgeons, thought they wanted to be, orthopedic surgeons or dermatologists, and who find radiation oncology late, or who happen to go through the SOAP process and end up being wonderful radiation oncologists. So, those individuals are out there. But I think the fundamental problem is that is not going to be the norm. That's not going to be typical. When you have a medical student who has spent most of their medical training thinking that they are going into a particular specialty and then sort of stumble into radiation oncology, there's a huge risk that they personally and professionally might be unhappy, displeased, or perhaps not well suited to our specialty. And in turn, from a specialty perspective, I don't think we want to look back, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and realize that a decent percentage of our currently active radiation oncologists are deeply dissatisfied and or really didn't want to be radiation oncologists and still haven't been convinced. I mean, I think that is what you risk when you fill a immediate problem with this very inappropriate Band-Aid for a massive hemorrhage. And so I think as many of our radiation oncology program directors, a really noble group, recently published this, essentially promise to not SOAP. And, a shout out to all my colleagues who were on that paper, including Jordan Karofa, Rahul Tendulkar, Emma Fields, Sushil Barwal, Albert Atia, and Ken Oliver. And I think, they tried to do the right thing and say, listen, yes, it hurts when your program doesn't fill. And yes, it is painful and embarrassing and all of these things. But in the end, we have to do the right thing for our specialty, and we vow not to SOAP. And I realize that's controversial. And I realize that, that's their choice. And certainly they were not in any way mandating anything, but simply trying to set an example. And that's, of course, allowed. But it's very disturbing on many levels if we are resorting to this when we need to be more proactive about reaching a more diverse group of students. This kind of gets back to my very first point about personality and fit. And a lot of students who are out there in medical schools where they don't have access to radiation oncology. We know we have a huge diversity problem in radiation oncology of racial, ethnic, gender, socioeconomic backgrounds. And what an incredible opportunity this is to make sure that we promote the various efforts through, for example, the ARROW Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Subcommittee, which was just recently initiated, the HEDI Council, which is currently up for vote through the ASTRO bylaw modification and recognition of the importance of the efforts for diversity, equity, and inclusion in our specialty. Why don't we take this as an opportunity to get more appropriate and committed students, even if they find radiation oncology late in their careers, rather than the last minute scramble? I mean, we all, I think, know that SOAP is euphemistically called a scramble. And the second you call a process by which you enter your potential future specialty for the rest of your life a scramble, I think you have to ask yourself, are we doing these people a favor, and are we doing our specialty a favor? So let's, not worry about the actual numbers. Yes, we will have unfilled slots in some programs, but we have to sort of be introspective and say, how do we take this as an opportunity to improve upon what we're not doing, including outreach to a more diverse group and more rural and underserved populations.
I appreciate excellent response to, I know, a tough question. Teresa, could you move to the next slide? It's going to be an audience poll question. And while that's going on, I'm going to open that same question that I just answered to the rest of the panel, if anyone else has something to add.
Yeah, Aaron, if I may address it.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so as being one of those upstarts who actually participated in SOAP, I think this is a very complicated question. And I think for the sake of radiation oncology, I think it's a little bit unwise to say that participation in SOAP is not the right thing to do. Dartmouth, where I practice, and I'm the program director, and prior to that was chair. It took us a lot of work to put our program together over several years, and eventually finished up and got that running about 5 years ago. And we have just started filling our spots. We take one a year, and as one of the NCI cancer centers, about 50 or so in the United States, we punch well above our weight. We have a relatively few number of faculty. We limit ourselves to one resident per year. All of our offerings are far in excess, and we have some very novel technologies which many other, even much larger programs do not have. So in terms of education, technological opportunities, and everything else, Dartmouth is truly at a national level. So as a new program, it took great courage for our first resident, and actually for our first few residents, to step into that space. And I'm not going to say which year, but we did participate in SOAP in 1 year. And I hated the experience. I didn't like it. And most importantly, we were never going to take an applicant who we did not feel would make us proud. So we had more than 150 applicants in SOAP for one spot. And we had less than a week to go through those applicants, screen them, interview them, and go through the multiple levels of making offers. And each time you make an offer, you can only make one. You can only make one. And the number of offers that you have spaces, and we had one space. So we make one offer and then go on to the next. But we did extremely well. And we interviewed some extraordinary medical students. So I think from the point of view of radiation oncology, what we need to do is take a step back and look at, first off, there are two separate issues. Number one is who's coming in, and then number two, how many are we putting out? From my point of view, the more applicants, the better. If we have 5-to-1 applicants to actual spaces, that's great. What we need in radiation oncology is human capital, and the higher the level of the human capital, the better. And frankly, human capital is both quality and quantity. If you have more, then you're going to be able to do more with it, looking at this very broadly. Jobs are something that one, of course, has to look at as a very factual matter, but very broadly, thinking of this as a policy matter, you know, having really bright, talented, motivated people is what we want. And SOAP can make you can find them, but you have to look, and it's hard work. And at the end of the day, if you don't have good applicants who are going to contribute to the specialty and aren't properly motivated, then you just don't make the offer. It's that simple. So I didn't like the experience. I'm really hoping never to have to do it again. And I'm sure that the education we're going to give these students is going to be absolutely phenomenal. And are they going to be good radiation oncologists? I'm absolutely sure of it. And we screened really hard to make sure we got the motivation down pat. Students are having a lot of trouble making decisions. Radon quite often hits our radar very late. I totally agree with Neha. We need to reach out more to minorities and underrepresented groups of all sorts. And we need to be reaching out to medical students early on so that we don't have these problems when it comes time to actually looking at applicants at the first pass. But if SOAP happens to be where you're at, and you have a really well-qualified applicant, and that person happens to be from an underrepresented group, so much the better. It's not a way to address this problem. That's not the strategy. You shouldn't rely on SOAP to do it, but certainly that can also be another angle to allow us more diversity in our groups as people move forward. But at the end of the day, if somebody's not a good applicant and they're not going to contribute to the specialty in a positive way, I don't care whether they're coming through a first time or they're coming through SOAP, forget about it.
I appreciate the alternate perspective. I'm sure this is a conversation that we could keep going over the entire hour, and we can continue any thoughts on it offline if needed. But thank you so much to both of you for answering that question. I would like to move on to the next one. Over the past several years, this one's going to be related. Teresa, could you go next slide, please? So over the past several years, individual radiation oncology programs with foreseen future growth have continued to expand residency slots despite decreases in applicant numbers. Is this appropriate? If so, why? If not, why? And what interventions should be implemented? I know some questions is similar to the last one, but I'll direct this one towards you as well, Alan, if you have any additional thoughts for this. Yeah, I think you might be muted. Alan, can you hear me?
Oh, I'm sorry. So you wanted me to go first. I'm very sorry.
Yeah, you got it. No, you got it.
Well, this is another way of asking the same question. And I think from an educational point of view, the question is the program going to be able to provide adequate education? If not, then it shouldn't have residents. So that's on the small side. And on the large side, if the group's going to be too large such that there's not going to be adequate attention given to the individual residents, I've seen large programs where individuals kind of float through in the corners and manage to not get really good mentorship on the way. The program itself needs to be honest with itself, whether it's providing really the highest quality education. If the expansion is going to get to the point of diminishing returns, at that point in time, again, it's getting too big. So there is such a thing as too small. There is such a thing as in terms of the size of the program, and there's such a thing as too big in terms of the size of the residency. So I think it requires honesty and a real clear image of what the educational program is doing and what they're producing at the other end and what the best way is to do that. There's nothing wrong with having a larger program, but it requires a lot more resources, and it really needs careful pruning and attention to make sure that everyone who's coming through is being well educated. At the other end, we do need to make sure that there are that we're expanding technologies and opportunities for our specialty, and there are lots of new spaces out there for graduates to go into. So per se, just because an educational program is getting bigger, that doesn't mean they're doing the wrong thing. But again, it's at the level of the review committee and the ACGME to make sure that the criteria are strict enough that we are educating people appropriately and that programs are well equipped to do the work that needs to be done.
Right. I appreciate it. For the sake of time, we'll move to the next question. I know I haven't given you a chance to answer much the last couple, Brian, so feel free to comment on those as well, along with this. Should conscious efforts be made to increase future applicant numbers? If not, why? If so, why? And what intervention should be implemented?
Would you like me to take a stab at that first?
Yeah, that's all yours.
Okay. We can get to some of these other things in the second hour, right? This
That's
is 2
right.
hours, right?
Yeah.
So many good discussion points have already been raised. You're right that we could go off for several more hours, but we have to sort of curtail it. Okay, I'm a simple country radiation oncologist. I don't know that much. If I was going to do a workforce analysis, I would probably start by saying, well, do we have about the right numbers of them right now? Let's say we have 5,100, because there's a reason I want to use easy numbers, right? And let's say people are in practice for 30 years. So it looks like maybe we need 170 people coming out a year. I'm just saying, maybe that's a starting point, but who knows whether that's the right point or not. And you would certainly have to recalibrate that. But be that as it may, whether we're right or wrong about guessing how many people need to come through, there was a point that was brought up that was really important that Neha brought up, I think, earlier, and it's worth amplifying, which is to say, we also, I think, should and do have an obligation to expand the population from whom we're drawing our applicants. And it's really hard, but we really, really, really have to commit to adding diversity into our population of folks going into the field. And how do you do that? Well, I think that's, there are people who are much smarter about this than I am. So I don't claim to know the final answer on this, but it's funny that there's a certain amount of mythology around the field that might actually be preventing people from coming in. So I can remember 1 or 2 surveys from not too long ago about why or why not the field might have appealed to some people. And there was some folks who perceived it to be so heavy in science and math that maybe that's not what they can do, and that's would be unfortunate, because I'm not going to say there's not some science and math involved, but I don't think that it's reasonable to think that you have to be an expert in particle physics to do things. I mean, I am a trope, okay? I personally am one of the several cultural tropes within the field, not because I'm a white middle-aged guy. That's part, okay, yes, partly because of that. Yes, that's true. But I'm a trope because I was an engineering student, right? I did engineering as an undergrad, and I fumbled my way through medical school and said, oh, look at this. That's kind of a techie field. Maybe it appeals to me. And it has worked out for me, and I've found it interesting. It's amusing and all this kind of stuff for me. But that's an ironic thing, because I can guarantee you that the actual physics and mathematics that drives the engine of this field is completely impenetrable to anybody on this phone call and to more than 1% of the people out there. I mean, can anybody really write the formula for Newton's method of iteration that's going on right now as we speak and optimizing our IMRT plans? I don't think so. We need a fundamental little bit of understanding of how things work and how the machines work. So we need to sort of actually deconstruct some aspects about the field to, I think, make it more appealing broadly, or make it less intimidating, because I think there are some misconceptions that are maybe our own fault that we should sort of deconstruct. It's not to say that we don't need to be smart, but I don't think we should propose that this field is something that is not attainable or not understandable by a lot of smart people who are out there who might have just maybe have some misunderstandings about that. So that's not really a direct answer to your question, but it's something that was bubbling up in my head as I was thinking about what the next question was going to be. But let me stop there, and someone else might have a better answer to add to that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And I do want to get into more details of the point you were making as far as diversity as well. Teresa, could we move to the next slide? So this poll question is going to be the similar question. Are there any other comments from anyone else on the panel about the questions we've gone over so far?
If I may add very quickly, in terms of what should be done, should we be increasing applicant numbers? From my point of view, the answer is always yes. There's nothing wrong with having more applicants. And, that's very different from the question of oversupplying the specialty. The applicants are not the issue. The issue is what's coming out on the other end. It's a harder screening if you've got an applicant ratio of 5-to-1, but I mean, who's to say that that's bad? But in any case, more importantly, I think is what we should be doing. And Astro and Neha can certainly speak more to this. Is taking some very good proactive education, organizational steps to address the issue. And the medical students, specifically to look at medical students' perceptions. And there's work on the website for the medical student section, and there are blogs coming in from residents, and there's a narrated video describing radiation oncology. Also for all of us, individual grassroots, get out there and talk to the students. We're not talking about many people, we're only talking about a couple of hundred people a year in terms of the actual applicants coming in. So we're looking for, a few hundred applicants. So it's not that many medical students in terms of actually coming through. And it's very quick and easy to change a social group from an ignorant to educated. So, for example, Nirav Kapadia, who is one of our wonderful attendings here, yesterday created an open house at which first and second year Dartmouth students, they came in, basically toured radiation oncology. We also brought in some of the Dartmouth undergrads and had the medical students touring through. And it was a lot of fun for all the faculty who were involved, and certainly was great for the medical students and allowed them a lot of opportunities to ask questions and gain some insight into our specialty. And frankly, I think that's what needs to be done, is we just need to get out there and let people know that the websites and the social media business, I don't think it's Russia collusion, but there is certainly some misinformation out there, and it's our responsibility, our opportunity to get out there and let people know what the truth is.
No, I appreciate that response. For the sake of time, we'll move on to the next question. Just to be cognizant, not much time left, so we can keep our answers just brief, but definitely good quality points as well. For this one's going to be for Neha. Overall applicant number decreases have only further exacerbated previously present shortages in underrepresented groups, ethnic minorities, females, et cetera. How would you recommend we increase the proportion of these applicants specifically?
So again, I think this is always going to be, like most complex problems, require a multi-pronged approach, right? So first, we need to hear from and understand from our current residents, what are some of the issues, the considerations that helped them make this choice? What are their thoughts about their choice now? What do they feel current medical students, so many of our residents are wonderful mentors to medical students and are in many ways closer to them than a lot of us faculty who don't get to work with them necessarily in the same way, or understand what their concerns are in the same way, because there's always going to be sort of a reticence to potentially a reticence to be fully honest with us. And so I'd love to, again, really give a shout out to Arrow and the fact that just by creating a subcommittee, which has wonderful leadership, from our existing Arrow members, really focused on diversity, equity, inclusion aspects that allow us to reach these students that wouldn't otherwise hear about the specialty. And I think this is where the pandemic has provided, I know it's been overstated, this idea of a silver lining, but we have to try and find those where we can. And I think one of the silver linings is that during this period where essentially elective rotations and away rotations were shut down for public health reasons, we created this opportunity to say, well, why not use these platforms and programs like Rover and other ways to provide virtual rad-onc education and create these forums for students who wouldn't perhaps have known or been able to travel and to get to a site to do a formal rotation. And so let's seize that and let's build on all of the work that's being done and think about what gaps there are that exist. And this is where we really encourage, our existing membership in radiation oncology, both academic and in community practices, to say, are there ways in which you can work with your local medical school and local institutions that perhaps don't know about radiation oncology, and just to get out there, just to make sure they're aware. And I've always said, even though it's going to take a long time for us to get where we need to be, I'm afraid it will, It doesn't mean we stop trying. And also, for every applicant that comes, potential applicant that comes and spends time with radiation oncologists and decides they want to go into a different specialty, that does not need to be seen as a terrible thing. We need internists and surgeons and pathologists who understand what we do. You know, it's I would argue, as important in some ways as making sure we have enough of our own. So, you know, you don't have to see that mentorship or that outreach as some sort of loss. And I think this is where efforts like these programs that are now virtual, that are resident and faculty led, are important. And the other thing is that there have been, and I think more schools are trying to do this, opportunities for scholarships for students who are not in a RadOnc associated medical school, who would need funds to be able to travel to do their away rotation at the site that they want to visit, and offering those scholarships, checking with your medical school and your department, can you sponsor some of that to also close the barriers? Because one of the things that's not often talked about is the socioeconomic divide, and to the extent that that often keeps students of all types, whether they have their own families they have to raise and money's tight, or they have other financial limitations that, you know, prevent them from traveling all over to do rad-onc electives. Let's close that gap in that regard as well. And so there are some very relatively small things we can do that could make a big difference. And then, of course, all the travel awards and scholarships and opportunities that our organizations are offering, particularly to diversify applicants. We need to publicize those more. We need to do a better job getting the word out to medical schools about many of those opportunities.
I appreciate that response so much. So many excellent points that hopefully we can further discuss a little bit more offline. We are about out of time. And so I would like to move on to this question for Erica. What could have improved the radiation oncology residency application process for you and your co-applicants?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I'm glad it went right after the one we were just talking about, underrepresented minorities, because I think that maybe something that has helped me but could have improved the application process for other co-applicants that maybe didn't have it is just having a mentor that that has helped me sort of envision myself and what I hope to be. And that was through the Aero Equity and Inclusion Subcommittee. I'm Puerto Rican, so finding a Hispanic, a Latino radiation oncologist definitely played a vital role in my decision to go into the field, and has been super encouraging throughout the entire process. I think in general, just, I know I keep saying this, but good mentorship relationships with residents and attendings, we cannot get enough of that. And I think that is, that's huge in our decision to pursue the field and to maintain ourselves encouraged, even despite some of the concerns. And also, I think it's encouraging that some of the concerns that I had expressed earlier about the job market, the oversupply of physicians, that those things don't have to do necessarily with the specialty itself, with what radiation oncologists are doing in a day-to-day practice. So just hearing more about why going into the field is worth it, and that is encouraging. Every specialty has pros and cons, and people still decide to go into them. So we need to be reminded about why attendings chose to do it, and how they continue to be fulfilled through it. I think that's all I have to say about that. I think really just mentorship. And then in terms of source, I know somebody had asked about good sources for us that maybe could improve, or just more longitudinal data about employment. So it's not just things that we're hearing on online forums and anecdotal evidence, but real data that we can get about this.
Thank you so much for that response. And I think there's so much to cover that's left in this talk, and we might possibly have a part two at this point, that we have so much left to do. I am going to end us here. I know there's a couple of questions left and plenty of chat questions. We're going to get all that answered offline and send it out. But just as far as a conclusion here, please fill out our post-webinar survey and consider joining the ACR to have access to both our past and future webinar events. I want to thank everyone in our audience today for joining us tonight. I hope our discussion will help spark some positive, actionable change for the future of our field. Also, thank you to Teresa Powell and Ari Amine for all of your contributions to this webinar series. And finally, special thanks to all of our panelists. I know this is a very difficult topic to discuss. You all did a remarkable job bringing up, I think, a lot of conflicting but very common perspectives on this issue. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, everyone. I look forward to seeing you all again at our next radiation oncology webinar. Look out for those offline responses to all of your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.